Hello. So I am joined, this will be a podcast talking about the anti-apartheid movement and the state of South Africa after it. I would like to introduce Sean Lewis. Sean, if you would like to kind of introduce yourself and give a little bit of background.
I'm not sure how much background I can give, but as introduced, name is Sean Lewis. I'm South African born, bred, 63 years old, married with two daughters. Um, so I've kind of grown up. I was born in 1962, which means that I grew up in I guess from 62 to 94 would be 32 years. So living for 32 years under apartheid. Um, I've been a teacher, student. I've worked in corporate, continue to work in corporate, teach at the university. So I've done a whole range of things, but essentially, yeah, I've kind of lived my life in South Africa. Although I spent 4 years in the US.
Okay, and so you were an anti-apartheid activist. What did your experience kind of look like as a anti-apartheid activist during the apartheid regime in South Africa?
It's it's hard to describe because it's not just one thing, right? It's not just one thing. So my first real encounters with opposing apartheid was in at high school when I was effectively your grade nine in 1976, and that was my first real encounter, and I struggled with it. I struggled with the with fighting apartheid because it was it seemed like we were. I'm not a big follower, and I I struggled with the notion of boycotting classes and marching and walking out because I didn't. I struggled to understand exactly how that's going to change things. But growing up in my student days, that changed. I so in my university, my tertiary education, that changed quite a bit. In that, I think I understood a lot better what the impact of protest would be. Um, so I went to a university which was designated as a white university. The University of Cape Town was designated as a university for white people only, which meant that for me to be accepted at the university, I needed to be accepted under a permit that allowed somebody of a different racial designation, as per the apartheid policy, to attend the university. So that was that was a challenge in and of itself. I we and I also formed part of a so I part of our being at that university, part of being at the university also, my community we basically took the position that we're at the university to get an education and nothing else. So people like me, I and people like me, went to classes, did our assignments, wrote exams, but didn't participate in any of the university activities. So I did my undergraduate years. I didn't participate in any social activities at university, any sporting activities, any. For me, the so our argument then was that if we wanted to participate in anything that builds community, we should do that in our communities and not at a university designated for white people. So
Okay,
that was
that was
part of
that was like part of their policy with you then.
when
Being
you said
like that was a caveat of you being admitted then was that you weren't
it
allowed.
wasn't their caveat, it was ours. We took
Okay.
up so my people like me took a position that we will limit our participation. So we won't validate the university by participating fully in all of its processes.
Okay.
Those were also those years were also around about 1980 were also the years in which student protests matured quite significantly. I was not a student activist; I was a community activist. So I was chairperson of a youth organization in my community, and that youth organization organized. So I was chairperson of the youth organization, and that youth organization tried to organize youth and mobilize youth against apartheid in various ways, in various kinds of protests, in various kinds of protests, demonstrations, boycotts, etc. I also form part of the executive of a civic organization, which I guess was aimed at homeowners, at adults living in the community. And that was the intention there, was to mobilize our community against apartheid. And we did that in different ways. So some of the things that I participated in, we boycotted we boycotted buses, for example. We boycotted the buses for many months. So I lived about, I would say, probably about 15 kilometers from the university. So in that year, I walked to university and back to campus and back because I wouldn't take the buses, So and lots of people. So you'd have these black kids walking along the highway, eventually getting to university, and we do our class and then walk back to our homes because we wouldn't take. We had boycotts around it. We had campaigns around a number of things. We had campaigns around red meat. We had campaigns around what they call sweets, chocolates, and stuff. And the campaigns weren't aimed at the meat per se. It was the campaigns, or at the buses per se. The campaigns were aimed at the companies who participated in apartheid in various ways. And what we were doing was to demonstrate our opposition to the companies that then sold that meat, the red meat, or sold the chocolates, or ran the bus companies. We participated in campaigns around housing, around housing, around trying to force the state to enable Black people who lived in houses for 20, 30, 40 years to get ownership of those houses so they could own the houses themselves. Because for many years, we had state-owned houses that were not sold to people. So people lived in the houses and paid rental in those houses for many years, but they were never allowed to own those houses. So there were numerous campaigns, and I think what I'm trying to suggest to you then is that we had a diversity of campaigns. That my life was characterized by a diversity of campaigns.
So it wasn't really like, it was more so aimed at just the background kind of companies and different aspects that kind of supported apartheid, not so much the government itself.
No. So the thing about something like apartheid is that apartheid didn't. The government is a small part of the apartheid machinery. Your entire economic infrastructure and your political infrastructure and your social infrastructure is governed by and enmeshed in by apartheid. So our approach to fighting apartheid was to view every part of that entire economic and social system as a site of struggle. So whether you are at a university or at a school or in a workplace, traveling on a bus, shopping somewhere, every place is a site of struggle. And what we would try to do is to build campaigns that enabled us to prosecute our struggle against apartheid in that site of struggle. So it wasn't like, so you don't view apartheid simply as a set of policies and simply as a government, because it's much more than that.
Yeah. Okay. And then was it difficult, or how were you kind of able to keep that mobilization up under the apartheid's regime? I know that they were pretty heavy with like cracking down on any kind of I guess you guys were more so boycotting and stuff, but did that really impact it a lot?
Look, we have a so we have a black population that comprises. So if I talk about black, then I talk about genetically black, right? So that we just make sure we understand our terminology. So South Africa have divided. So the apartheid policy divided our country up into white, in broad categories: white, Indian, colored, and African. So white people comprised about 10% of the population, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
Indians are relatively small, about 5 to 6% of the population. Coloreds also slightly bigger, probably 8 to 9%. And the majority of the population was African. So when I talk about black, I talk of genetically black is includes everybody who was African, colored, and Indian, who were designated African, colored, and Indian by apartheid policy, because we part of our I guess gaining political consciousness and showing solidarity with each other was the rejection of racial categories which sought to divide us and put us against each other, and accept the designation of being black as a generic category, and which united us against a set of laws which discriminated against us. And that black population comprised what, more than 80% of the population. So while the government persecuted them and they killed people, and they killed young people, and they put people in prison, and they beat people, that they so you know, there's cascading levels of repression. They there were just too many people for them to kill or beat or imprison or whatever. I personally was never imprisoned I personally was never imprisoned. What did happen though was that I did lose my job as I was a teacher. I was a high school teacher. In the first 3 years after I started teaching, I finished university studies and I was teaching at high school. I was banned. I was banned from schools within the borders of the Republic of South Africa. So I wasn't allowed to be on the premises of a school within the country's borders.
Oh, okay.
Because of my political activity. So I was forced to. I was basically lost my job. I had to move back in with my parents, sell my car, and try and figure out how to create a life for myself afterwards. Mm-hmm. So everybody wasn't killed, but there were lots of people who were killed.
Yeah.
Everybody wasn't detained and tortured, but there are lots of people who were detained and tortured. Everybody wasn't beaten by police, but there were lots of people that were beaten. And then there were other measures, like with mine, I was banned. And that's because of my activities in political organizations.
Okay. And then that sounds really interesting. Huh? Yeah, firing people or like taking them out of the job is a pretty strong way to try and, I guess, silence their like social movement, their, solidarity.
Well, you see so I spoke a little bit about my life as a student and my various forms of activism, but I remained active. I was an activist for a very, very long time. So even when I finished school and finished university, I remained an activist. I was also a sports activist, and I can talk a little bit about that if you like. But I was also an educational activist. So I was a teacher, and as a teacher, what I was very active in doing was creating what was called the Western Cape Teachers Union. So I lived in a region called the Western Cape, and I was active in creating that organization. I went around. Used to ride a little motorbike, and I would ride my motorcycle from one school to another, and and talk to teachers there and try and bring them into this organization that we wanted to create. Also, at the same time, there was lots of unrest in our schools. There was lots of unrest in our schools, and our students were boycotting, protesting and boycotting right across the country, not just at my school. But there were so I was one of those teachers that was trusted by the students as an ally in the struggle against apartheid. So if you look at that combination of being a sports activist, being a community activist, being an educational activist, and being involved in the struggle in various ways, you then understand that the state identifies all of those, because we had spies everywhere and the state was watching, and they decided that they would try and clip my wings. And one way to do that is to prevent me from keep me away from students and other teachers. If you ban me from schools, I can't get to other teachers and to students. And also, if you take away my means of sustaining myself, you put me in a little box. So it's, yeah, the impact is, yeah, that was kind of the nature of the beast. But I have friends who were imprisoned, and I have friends who were tortured, and I have friends who were kept in solitary confinement, because so it's a I come from a generation of people that have had to deal with struggle in various ways.
Yeah. And then about like the different I guess mobilization techniques or different ways that were used to kind of uh like kind of tackle apartheid or attack apartheid. Some of them internationally included like protests internationally, banning from Olympics, the arms embargoes and sanctions and such. How important do you think that the kind of international pressure was in ending apartheid? Do you think that that played a significant role?
Going back to my previous comment that I made about sites of struggle, so and our view of apartheid as not just being government and laws, but an entire economic and social infrastructure, including our global relationships forged by South Africa. We then so our struggle in South Africa took the form of treating every place where South Africa was as a site of struggle, whether that was in global trade, whether that was internally in the country, whether that was in the workplace. We treated every part as a site of struggle. And in that way, we wanted to completely isolate South Africa and apartheid South Africa from the rest of the world, and force apartheid South Africa to well, basically, we wanted to break apartheid South Africa, force it down to its knees.
Mhm.
That way. And I think, and I don't know which one was more important, more impactful. I think all of it, every piece was a small piece, but all those small pieces together contributed to a massive struggle that brought apartheid to its knees.
Okay. And then this is kind of more about South Africa, the state of South Africa now after apartheid. So one of the kind of policies under apartheid, a lot of Black and colored South Africans were forced to live in like townships, a lot of like Soweto and a lot of rundown townships, and a lot were paid very low wages during that. Um, and many people are still, from at least from when I visited, are still living in these townships, and there's not really a lot of prospects for upward mobility for people that are kind of stuck there. Um, has South Africa kind of, do you think, done enough to address the economic disparities that apartheid created?
I guess the simple answer is no. The simple answer is no. So what I think we've made a lot of mistakes in the last 30 years since we ended apartheid. And some of those mistakes include we had an opportunity to change things quite fundamentally. You know, that first year, 1994, 1994, we had an opportunity to change the way that we existed in the world and in relation to each other in the country in many quite fundamental ways. Part of that would have been to ensure that we completely rid ourselves of the language of apartheid, that language of colored, Indian, African, and white, and we failed to do that. But even more fundamentally was to break down that massive divide between rich and poor, and we failed to do that too. So we've maintained both the language of apartheid as well as that massive divide between rich and poor. Now, while some Black people have managed to, a small number of Black people have managed to acquire wealth, the wealth in the country is still largely concentrated in the hands of white people. And Black people in South Africa have largely been unable to break the shackles of poverty in order to be able to take advantages of opportunities for upward mobility. And in terms of the opportunities for upward mobility, we've created very little, if anything. Where the areas where we've created opportunities for upward mobility has been from the middle class, from that Black middle class, the educated middle class, into a wealthier upper class. So I was not rich. My family's not rich. I'm still not rich, but I'm in that comfortable middle class where I own my own home, can drive a car that I don't owe any money on, and that kind of thing. So I'm a comfortable middle class, but I'm the exception and not the rule. So yeah.
Do you think that there was is there anything that you think specifically that the government or the countries, like a society, could have done to kind of push it in that more positive way?
And the two things, so there are quite a few things I think that we could have and should have done. And I know that hindsight is 2020, right? Because so for one thing, I think we should never have reintroduced the language of apartheid. I think that's death to a social formation, because the moment you introduce that, even if you have the best intentions in the world, the moment you create a visible division between one person and another, you create a competition for resources between those individuals who have visible differences. So that for me was something we should never have done. A second thing that we should never have done was a second thing we should have done better was to look after our infrastructure. So we had very good infrastructure. We had some very good infrastructure, and I say this, but I need to make sure that I don't create the wrong impression. What our government was very focused on was providing infrastructure to areas that didn't have infrastructure. If you think about apartheid South Africa had excellent infrastructure for white people. But the moment you moved out of the areas, and then they created laws to demarcate those areas for white people, and those areas that were not for white people, they didn't develop those infrastructure. So roads weren't. So you either didn't have roads, or the roads weren't that well maintained. Didn't have street lights, or the street lights weren't maintained. Didn't have sewage, or the sewage wasn't well maintained, and so on. You can go on. If you think of any kind of infrastructure and amenities, you think of white areas had beautiful first world-class infrastructure, and Black people didn't. That was the nature of the beast, right? So what our governments were very focused on from day one from 1994 was on providing infrastructure and homes and that kind of thing to a larger group of people. And in many ways, they've been successful. So there's electricity has been rolled, electrification of townships has been massive. So there are many, many more areas that have streetlights now that didn't have streetlights before. There are many, many more areas that have water, running water, that didn't have running water before. There are many millions of South Africans that live in houses where there were no houses before. So from a perspective in terms of the numbers of the rollout of infrastructure and stuff to a much wider population, this government has been successful to some extent. The challenge, though, is that we've in achieving that success, we didn't look very well after the legacy, the excellence of infrastructure that we had. So we didn't maintain what we had very well. And the biggest example of that is probably our electricity problem.
Yeah.
While we've extended the network, the electricity grid massively across the country, we neglected the power generation and power distribution capability. So, and even when we were told about it, because the government knew that we would run out of power, out of the ability to generate electricity, but didn't do anything about it because we were so focused on making sure that the most remote areas in the country got street lights and the most remote area of the country got these bits and pieces, that they didn't invest in looking after the infrastructure that we had. And when the infrastructure started to decay, it decayed rapidly. So what we should have done better, again, 2020, the hindsight is 2020. What we should have done better was to look better after the infrastructure that existed, while at the same time extending the benefits of the infrastructure to the entire population more effectively. That's one thing that we should have done better. Another thing we should have done better was to invest in our own capability, so that we can do more as a country. We should be able to do more. Do more in terms of producing food, do more in terms of producing clothes, and do more in terms of producing the things that we needed for our day-to-day lives. In order that on the one hand, we create jobs and create a more stable economy, and on the other hand, we satisfy the needs of our people. And we haven't done that very well. So there's a lot that we could have done better. The biggest shame that we have to live with is the fact that we've increased the divide between the richest and the poorest people in the country, and the poorest people in the country are still Black. And so that's probably the biggest indictment on this country. So regardless of all the good that's happened, the biggest indictment on South Africa today is that the Gini efficient is bigger today than it was 30 years ago, and the bulk of our poor people are still Black. That's massive.
So then I guess that kind of answers my one of my next questions about the ANC. The ANC has been the governing body since the end of apartheid, and they've kind of had a lot of promises of bettering, housing and schools and stuff for marginalized communities. But you're saying that essentially they've kind of done that, but without really maintaining it as a broad overall, the infrastructure and all those other things, right?
Yeah, the ANC has made a lot of mistakes. And at one point, I was a card-carrying ANC member. I wasn't always. I mean, as a young man, I wasn't. As a young man, I thought the ANC was too liberal. So we had a number of different political philosophies in the country. So there were some philosophies that some people who believed that we should try and win political power. And with political power, once we have political power, we can change the country. and the ANC was part of that grouping, and it wasn't the ANC alone, but the ANC was part of that grouping of organizations that believe that by winning political power, we can, our first battle, our battle should be to win political power, and then we can manage the rest out. Then there was a grouping that was considered, and they called us various things, but they called us ultra leftist, and in large part because we argued then that winning political power is not enough. Because if you simply take over the reins of government, you haven't solved the fundamental economic and social problems of the country. And the struggle has to be a permanent struggle to take control of the reins of political, social, and economic power in order to impact on the quality of life of all South Africans. Now, and this was the dichotomy for me as a young man, right? I don't think either one or the other is 100% right. Today, as a 63-year-old man, I look back and I think, sure, I was passionate and idealistic, and I wanted a permanent revolution. So I believed in the permanent revolution, and I thought that was what I needed to struggle for. I suspect that I'm not as radical and idealistic as I used to be, but I still believe that the ANC, that we took, as a country, we took political power through the ANC, but we didn't exercise enough influence over the economic levers of power and over the social levers of power in order to transform the country enough. The ANC is not the only organization, the ANC wasn't even the only organization in exile. The ANC was in exile, the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress, was in exile, ZAPO was in exile, SASCOC, the South African Sports and Congress, and Olympic Sports Council and Olympic Congress, all of those. SANROC was in exile. SANROC, not SASCOC. SANROC was in exile. So we had a number of organizations that were in exile, and the one wasn't necessarily bigger or better than the other. The one was an Africanist organization. The ANC was a nationalist organization. The PAC was a Pan-Africanist organization. ZAPO was closely aligned to the PAC, but was kind of a Black consciousness organization. SANROC was essentially represented the sporting movement in outside of South Africa, and was kind of spearheaded the isolation of South Africa in sport. So we had all of those organizations, and then inside the country we had other organizations. We had my youth movement, my youth organization, my local community youth organization was affiliated to the Western Cape Youth League, to the Cape Youth Congress. The Cape Youth Congress, in turn, was affiliated to the United Democratic Front. And the United Democratic Front was kind of the leader of popular resistance inside the country, while the ANC was outside of the country. And the United Democratic Front was an umbrella body that included churches and trade unions and student organizations and youth organizations. It was massive. So you understand that the ANC was an important, but only one of many players on the board. And one of the fictions of South Africa was that the ANC liberated South Africa, which is not true. The ANC contributed to the liberation, and I don't ever want to take anything away from the ANC and the almost deified status of Nelson Mandela, because I think he was an extraordinarily great man. But the ANC was a part of a much larger struggle, a struggle that was much larger than just the ANC. But when we got to 1994, we as a country, as a citizens, vested political power in the ANC. And one of the challenges with doing that was we vested political power in an organization that was very focused on winning a war against apartheid and didn't have a lot of knowledge or experience of running a country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you think about it, right? But that's those. I believe that that first government, that first ANC government, that in the first 5 years, 5 maybe to 10 years, was actually a government of people that were absolutely 100% committed to the struggle against apartheid, and they took decisions on a highly principled basis. But that organization called the ANC, once it returned to South Africa, once it was unbanned and returned to South Africa, got a number of new entries into the organization who were political careerists and not necessarily idealists who wanted to create a better world, but political careerists who wanted to create a better world for themselves. So we lost out a lot in terms of, so that was one problem. We had a lot of political careerists that then came in. So as the years went by, the old guard, which was highly principled, started dying out and fading out, and the new guard that came in wasn't necessarily as principled. That was the one challenge. Another challenge was the ANC believed that it needed to be in control of every part of government down to the last nuts and bolts. So it wanted to have political power in the form, as in formulating policy, but it also wanted to have executive power, as in executing that policy on the ground. What that meant was that the ANC then started to recruit, and the ANC wanted to control that entire value chain. And in order to do that, the ANC then made sure that their people were running the entire value chain, and there was not a clear separation between policy formulation and policy execution. And so you have a challenge with that. You're seeing it in your country right now. That separation between policy formulation and policy execution, that was a big problem. In addition to that, because they wanted loyalists, because the ANC were looking for loyalists and not necessarily, they put loyalty ahead of competence. So they employed loyalists to execute policy. Now, when you put a loyal ANC member in charge of cleaning rivers, maintaining the oceans, maintaining our oceans, generating electricity, building and maintaining roads, you might not necessarily get the best results if they're not competent.
Definitely.
You're seeing it in your country right now.
Definitely seeing it right now in our country.
You're seeing exactly that. So your country might not go to the dogs in a day, but if it continues, your country is going to go to the dogs because your president is appointing loyalists and not competent people.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, this is not about the US.
No, but that's a very good parallel to kind of, I guess, for people that, don't know that much about apartheid, or, kind of seeing that parallel is definitely very, very relevant.
Yeah.
And then I guess in terms of like South African society and like the culture and stuff in South Africa, how do you kind of think that it's changed since apartheid? I know you said that, with the apartheid language, it's kind of still been adopted, but I guess in terms of like attitudes, how do you think that has kind of changed?
Look, I mean, you by now you must know that by now you figured out that I don't like the language of apartheid very much. So I think that's unfortunately been it was unfortunately reintroduced. So for the first 5 years, from 1994 till about 1999, the country actually moved away from using the language of apartheid. And then it was reintroduced by the government, by the president of the country, by the new president, by Thabo Mbeki. It was reintroduced by him, the notion of four nations living in one country. And that reintroduction then gained traction. And before we knew it, this reintroduction of this language of apartheid became the norm, and it's now the norm again. And it's horrible. It's horrible, but that is probably not our most fundamental problem. Our most fundamental problem is the economic disparity between rich and poor. And then for me personally, my personal view is that the biggest political problem that we have is the massive fragmentation of our political landscape. So we have too many people, I believe, that have stood up and believe that they know exactly what the right thing is for South Africa. As a consequence, you end up with 34 parties on the ballot sheet, because there are 34 different groupings of people who believe that they have the right answer for South Africa, and they don't want to work with the other 33 groupings, because so we've got this massive fragmentation of our political landscape, with all of these and the figureheads that for each of these parties that attack the other parties, the other 33, because in order to position themselves, they're not positioning themselves based on a value proposition to South African citizens. They often position themselves in contrast and in conflict with others. So all we have is a fragmented political landscape with too much posturing and ego and conflict, and very little searching for a value-based consensus that would be able to drive this country forward. So for me, that's my belief is the fundamental problem with our political landscape. I don't know if that's the answer you were expecting or looking
I
for.
guess also kind of like I guess like the citizens of South Africa, do you think that, the I guess racism in South Africa has that kind of dissipated fairly well? I know you said that it was kind of the language was done away.
It's probably no different from the US now. In terms of racism, right? We're probably no different from the US now. So you have, on the one, right now in the US now and in South Africa, you're gonna have white extremists, right? Who still believe that they are superior to all other races in your country. And on the other end, you're gonna have black extremists. In your country, those black extremists is a very, very small grouping of people, almost inconsequential, but they exist. In South Africa, the black extremists is significantly larger, and that's in large part because our political policies and economic policies have failed. So it forces people to take it kind of drives people to take extreme positions. But in the middle, you have there's a lot of people treating people like people, so you have people dating and marrying across the races, and that's normal. You have children born out of mixed race marriages, and that's normal. So the dynamics, while I think the scale might be different, the dynamics I don't believe are that fundamentally different from the US. But incidentally, you have the same history. Your history is very similar.
I know that our segregation kind of policies of the Jim Crow era and stuff were actually inspired by apartheid, so that does not surprise me.
No, you guys came first.
Oh,
we
really?
followed you. Yeah, South Africa followed the US.
Oh,
You
that's
guys,
right. No, that's right. You were
yeah,
inspired.
you guys came first.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of parallels. Very interesting.
There are lots of parallels.
I guess I guess the US should kind of take from, I guess, South Africa's, I guess, shortcomings, maybe if we want to get better, hopefully.
Well, we must all learn from each other. I mean, and we have these notions. We have these notions. So the US is big, talks big on democracy. We have yeah. I mean, if there's one country that believes it is the bastion, the absolute bastion, the epitome of democracy, it's the United States of America. But democracy takes many, many different forms. And maybe democracy is not the only way that countries have actually turned things around. I mean, if you look at there are countries where you actually have, in Burkina Faso, you have a, a leader of Burkina Faso that was not elected.
Mm-hmm.
And he runs that country with an iron. He runs the country with an iron fist, but he's doing extremely well in turning the country from poverty and improving the general quality of life in the country. So maybe there are other models, and I'm not suggesting that we should all now suddenly become embrace fascism or the single party rule as the norm, but your dual party system in the United States is not the be all and end all of democratic processes. And maybe we need to be looking around. In Singapore took 17 years to go from being one of the poorest countries on the planet to being one of the wealthiest countries on the planet, but by GDP. 17 years, but 17 years under the rule of somebody who governed with an iron hand. It was elected, but governed both with a firm grip on the policies, but also with having established partnerships with labor, with all the different sectors, in order to lift the country as a whole. So, and again, I'm not saying that everybody should be like Singapore or everybody should be like Burkina Faso, but I'm saying that what we should accept is that we can learn from each other. We should learn from. I've been to Beijing. I've been to China twice, and I marveled at the way a city like Beijing with a population of 15 million was so efficient and so well run and so clean. You know, so we can learn, and we have to accept that we should learn from each other. I can go on. I can talk about Thailand, and I can go on, but yeah, I'm sorry. I get carried away. You asked me about things that I'm passionate about.
No, I appreciate the kind of comparisons between, I guess, the experiences between, South Africa, the US, Burkina Faso, all the other countries. It definitely does kind of put into perspective the state of each of them, kind of. And then I guess lastly, for you, based on like your experience as in the anti-apartheid movement as an activist, what advice would you give to young activists that are like involved in social movements today?
That's such a difficult question, and I thought about it. I mean, I saw your question, and I thought about that question. It's such a difficult question. I have a daughter who is 22 years old. So the question that you're basically asking me is, what advice would I give to my daughter and her friends? And I have tried to teach my daughter. I've tried to teach her to be aware of what is happening around her, and to make up her own mind about what is right. So firstly, to be aware of everything as it's happening around her, to try and instill in her a moral compass, so she has a sense of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, and then to make up her own mind about what is right and appropriate for her in her time, regardless of what I believe is right and appropriate for me. And if I was going to share anything with young people today, it would be about educate yourself about the world that you're living in and make your own decisions based on your understanding of the world and the facts and the evidence that is available, and avoid the herd mentality of social media.
Mhm.
That
Would you
if yeah,
would you say that like your like when in your activism your kind of way was tackling not just the government but also all of the different kind of institutions and the companies and such that kind of supported the policies that of something you were trying to kind of dismantle? Would you say that that's a good kind of point of social movements of activism, is kind of tackling the I guess underlying aspects?
absolutely. I would, and maybe coming back to my site of struggle, treat every place that you are at, every situation you're in, as a site of struggle, and look at what you can do to improve conditions in that site. And it can be small things. I mean, it's a small things. I mean, just getting people to see, if you're in school at the moment, getting people to see other people differently, getting people to treat other people differently, understanding that, understanding things like disability, understanding things like drug addiction, so that we create a more compassionate world, a more understanding world, a world in which people care about each other because they are people and not for any other reason. That I can't see. I can't. I'm not proposing politics or anything. I'm proposing just care about people because they're people. You know, in South Africa, you probably have heard. It sounds like you know quite a bit about South Africa. You've heard of the concept of Ubuntu. Have you heard
Mhm.
of the concept of Ubuntu? That people are people because of other people, and and I believe that we should be, in our daily lives, we should be becoming the people we want to be and we want to see in the world. That's it.
I think that's pretty good advice. I think that would be a good thing for people to kind of take away. Um, I think that kind of, I guess, wraps it up a bit.
Cool.
That sounds good. I really appreciate all of your insight, especially kind of how you know, dismantling apartheid and how that's kind of transitioned now into South Africa society today. I really appreciate your insight.
It's just one perspective. It's just my perspective. So it's not the gospel. It's just what I know. It's what, yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much.
It's an absolute pleasure and good luck with this.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I can